right, let's jump right in to this deep dive into Kenneth Burke and a rhetoric of motives,
Sounds good.
specifically the section that you've shared with us. This deep dive, I think, is going to explore some unexpected connections between things like rhetoric, social hierarchies,
Hmm. Ah,
mysticism,
yeah.
even a little bit of pop culture. We're going to be seeing how these seemingly different ideas kind of all intertwine in some really fascinating ways.
Yeah, it's really remarkable how Burke unveils these really subtle ways that rhetoric shapes our understanding of everything.
Oh, yeah.
And not just in terms of like fancy speeches or persuasive techniques, but how images and questions, even our experiences of awe and wonder, are infused with this rhetorical power.
So we're going way beyond just the surface level of language here.
Exactly. Burke argues that even like a seemingly simple image can actually reveal these hidden social and moral hierarchies.
Okay.
He uses this example from Henry James, where the description of a mounted, hung, framed, and glazed portrait subtly reinforces a character's high social status.
So those words aren't just describing a picture. They're actually encoding a message about power and prestige.
Exactly. It's a visual shorthand for saying this person is elevated above others.
Wow, that's a really great example. Now, it makes me wonder what other hidden hierarchies we might be missing in everyday language and imagery.
Well, that's the question Burke encourages us to ask. He connects this idea of hidden hierarchies to this other fascinating concept of mysticism.
Okay, this is where it gets really intriguing to me. How do hierarchies and mysticism relate to each other?
Well, Burke dives into this challenge of separating true mystical experiences from natural phenomena.
Hmm.
Like, for example, he examines these mystics who claim unity with God.
Yeah.
Is this a genuine spiritual experience or just a powerful psychological phenomenon?
It's like that age-old debate of faith versus reason, right?
Exactly. Burke's not claiming that all mystical experiences can be explained away by science, but he is prompting us to seek both naturalistic and supernatural explanations to consider multiple perspectives.
So it's about having an open mind and not jumping to conclusions. I like that approach.
It's really crucial for understanding Burke's work. And this brings us to a seemingly strange connection, the comedian Jimmy Durante.
Okay, now this I have to hear. What does Jimmy Durante have to do with rhetoric and mysticism?
So Burke uses this anecdote about Durante encountering this really snooty actor on his way up the social ladder. And Durante quips, "You'd better be nice to those you pass on the way up, for you might pass them again on the way down."
Right. Classic Durante. But what's the rhetorical point here?
Burke highlights the social weight of the questions we ask. The urgency we feel towards a question is often tied to its perceived importance within a hierarchy, not just the quest for answers.
So it's not just about what we ask, but who's doing the asking and why.
Exactly. And different groups or schools of thought might value certain questions over others, influencing how those answers are received. It's this really complex dance of social dynamics and power dynamics all interwoven with rhetoric.
This is starting to make me see everyday conversations in a whole new light.
And this is really just scratching the surface. Burke goes on to connect these ideas to even bigger concepts like identification transcendence and even the sublime.
Hold on, transcendence. That's a pretty loaded term. How does Burke define that in the context of rhetoric?
He's suggesting that rhetoric isn't just about persuasion. It's about how we connect with each other on this deeper level, how we create meaning and even transcend our own individual limitations. And identification is key to this whole process.
So by identifying with something outside ourselves, we can somehow move beyond your own boundaries.
That's the idea. Think about like a sports fan who identifies so strongly with their team that their individual identity merges with something larger.
Oh, yeah. Or maybe someone who finds solace in nature, feeling this sense of awe and wonder when standing in front of a towering mountain.
Exactly. And Burke argues that this active identification can actually be a form of transcendence. It's about connecting with something that takes us beyond our everyday selves.
Okay, that's starting to make sense. But how does this relate to rhetoric? Is he saying that language itself can be transcendent?
He's saying that rhetoric is the art of creating those moments of identification. Whether it's a powerful speech, a piece of music, or even a well-crafted advertisement, effective rhetoric taps into our desire to connect, to belong, to transcend those limitations.
So it's like rhetoric can be a tool for building bridges between individuals, groups, even ideas.
Precisely. And in that sense, it can be a profoundly humanizing force.
I'm starting to see how all these seemingly disparate ideas, hierarchies, mysticism, identification, transcendence are starting to weave together into a cohesive whole.
And it gets even more fascinating as we delve deeper into Burke's exploration of the sublime.
Now, the sublime, that sounds pretty lofty. What does
Mhm.
Burke mean by that term exactly? And how does it fit into this whole picture of rhetoric and transcendence?
Well, for Burke, the sublime is all about those experiences of awe and grandeur, those moments that make you feel small in the face of something vast and powerful. He uses the example of identifying with the power of a mountain.
So even something as massive and imposing as a mountain can be a source of transcendence.
Exactly, because in that moment of awe, we're simultaneously overwhelmed by the mountain's power and liberated by it. It's this paradoxical feeling that Burt argues is central to the experience of the sublime.
That makes me think of how people talk about feeling a sense of freedom when they're looking out at the ocean or gazing at a starry sky.
Exactly.
It's like this vastness that somehow makes you feel both insignificant and incredibly alive at the same time.
Precisely. And Burke's insights can help us understand how art and literature can evoke those same complex emotions.
So we've gone from hidden hierarchies in picture frames to the transcendent power of a mountain, all through the lens of rhetoric. This is definitely making me rethink how I see the world.
That's the power of Burke's work. He helps us see the familiar in a completely new way.
This has been an incredible journey so far, but I have to admit my brain is starting to feel a little full. Perhaps we could take a moment to let these ideas settle before we dive into the next layer of Burke's thinking.
I agree. We've covered a lot of ground. And there's still so much more to explore. It's fascinating how Burke connects these ideas about identification and transcendence back to some of the classic principles of rhetoric, like those outlined by Aristotle.
Oh, you mean like the ethos, pathos, logos trio? I remember learning about those in school, but it'd be great to hear how Burke kind of brings those into play.
He weaves them in masterfully. Remember, ethos is about credibility and trust. Pathos is about emotional appeal. And logos is about logic and reason.
Right. But how do those seemingly simple concepts contribute to this idea of rhetoric as a force for connection and transcendence? It seems like a bit of a leap.
Well, think about it this way. When a piece of art, a speech, or even an ad truly moves us, it's often because it's hitting on all three of those cylinders. We trust the source, we connect emotionally, and the argument resonates logically.
I see what you mean. It's not just about manipulation or trickery. It's about this synergy between those elements to create a deeper connection.
Exactly. And that's where those moments of transcendence that Burke talks about can emerge. When ethos, pathos, and logos align just right, we can feel transported beyond our everyday concerns, connecting with something bigger than ourselves.
That makes me think of how engrossed you can get in a good book, or how a powerful speech can leave you feeling inspired and energized.
Perfect examples. And Burke stresses that this ability to create these moments of identification and transcendence through rhetoric is a powerful force in human affairs.
It makes me think of how we often look to leaders, artists, even brands for inspiration. It's like we're seeking that connection and that sense of belonging that you're describing.
And rhetoric, when done skillfully, can provide a framework for those connections to form. But before we go too far down that path, you mentioned Aristotle earlier, and there's another one of his concepts that I think is helpful here.
Oh, right. You were talking about enthymeme, I think. I vaguely remember that from my rhetoric class. But could you refresh my memory on how that fits in?
Of course. An enthymeme is basically an argument where a piece of the logic is left unsaid. The audience has to fill in the gap.
So it's like a rhetorical puzzle that the audience has to solve.
You could say that. And this is where the idea of an active audience comes in. Aristotle believed that effective rhetoric wasn't about just passively receiving information, but engaging the audience's intellect and inviting them to participate in constructing meaning.
That makes sense. It's the difference between being lectured at and having a conversation. When you're actively thinking, you're much more likely to be persuaded, or at least to really consider the argument.
Exactly. And that's what makes enthymemes so powerful. It taps into our curiosity, our desire to make sense of the world, and to actively engage in the process of understanding.
I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. But there's one thing that keeps nagging at me. Burke places so much emphasis on identification, being key to persuasion and even transcendence. But couldn't identification also be used to manipulate people into believing things that aren't true?
That's a very sharp observation. And it's something Burke grappled with as well. He recognized the power of rhetoric for both good and bad. Propaganda and manipulative advertising rely on their same principles of identification.
That's what worries me. If rhetoric can be used to inspire and uplift, it can also be used to deceive and control. How do we distinguish between the two?
That's where critical thinking becomes crucial. We need to be aware of the techniques being used to persuade us, and we have to evaluate the message itself. Does it appeal to reason? Does it align with our values? Does it inspire us to be better? Or is it preying on our fears and biases?
So we can't just be passive recipients of all the messages bombarding us every day. We need to be active participants questioning assumptions and evaluating the evidence for ourselves.
Precisely, and that's a vital takeaway from Burke's work. He's not just explaining the mechanics of rhetoric, but prompting us to be more mindful, more discerning in how we process information.
This has been so illuminating. It's incredible how Burke connects these seemingly unrelated concepts to create a more profound understanding of how language shapes our world.
It truly is, and there's still more to uncover. Burke delves deeper into the connections between rhetoric and mysticism, and how those ideas can illuminate our understanding of literature and even everyday language.
I'm ready to dive in. I'm curious to hear how those seemingly separate realms intertwine. All right, we're back for this final part of our deep dive into Kenneth Burke and a rhetoric of motives. I'm still processing all those connections we've made between rhetoric and transcendence, and even Aristotle's classic theories.
Yeah, it's quite a journey. And Burke saves some of his most thought-provoking insights for this last section, where he circles back to this idea of mysticism and its relationship to rhetoric. He suggests they might be more interconnected than we think.
Now that's an interesting twist. Mysticism and rhetoric seem like completely different worlds to me. One is focused on spiritual experiences. The other is all about the art of persuasion. So how does Burke bridge that gap?
Well, he points out that both mysticism and rhetoric involve a transformation of perspective. Mysticism aims to kind of transcend the limits of the individual ego and merge with something larger. Rhetoric, meanwhile, shifts our understanding of the world through language and symbols.
Okay, I can see a faint glimmer of connection there. But could you maybe give us a more concrete example of how those two concepts intersect?
Sure, consider the language that mystics use to describe their experiences. Words like unity, oneness, transcendence, they're trying to articulate something beyond ordinary language. But at the same time, they're using those very words to create a sense of identification with their audience, drawing them into that experience even if it's just through imagination.
So even when talking about something supposedly ineffable, they're still employing rhetoric to communicate that experience.
Exactly. Burke highlights this really crucial insight. Even the most mystical experiences are ultimately mediated through language and symbols. This means rhetoric plays a role in shaping how we understand those experiences, both for ourselves and for others.
That's a fascinating point. It makes you wonder about the role of language in all spiritual or transcendent experiences.
It certainly does, and Burke takes this idea a step further by connecting it to the power of literature.
Literature. How does that fit into this conversation about mysticism and rhetoric?
Burke argues that literature, like mysticism, offers a way to transcend the limitations of our everyday perspective and to step into these new worlds of meaning. He uses the term mimesis to describe this process.
Mimesis. That sounds familiar. Does that just mean imitation?
It's a bit more nuanced than that. In a literary sense, mimesis is about creating this representation of reality that's both faithful to the original and transformative. It captures the essence of something while adding this layer of interpretation and meaning.
So it's not just about copying reality,
Yeah.
but representing it in a way that helps us see it with fresh eyes.
Precisely. And that's the magic of great literature. It takes us into the hearts and minds of others, allowing us to expand our understanding of the world and ourselves.
So in a way, literature acts as a kind of rhetorical alchemy, transforming our perspectives and opening up new possibilities for identification and transcendence.
Beautifully put. And Burke reminds us that this power of rhetoric isn't confined to high-flown literature or mystical experiences. It's woven into the fabric of our everyday lives. It's in how we communicate, the stories we tell, the images we consume.
So essentially, we're all swimming in this sea of rhetoric, whether we're aware of it or not.
Exactly. And the more we understand how it works, the more equipped we are to navigate that sea consciously and critically.
Well, this deep dive has been such an eye-opening experience for me. We've covered so much ground, from hidden hierarchies and the sublime to the connections between mysticism, literature, and everyday rhetoric.
It's been a privilege to explore these ideas with you.
And to our listeners out there, I want to leave you with a final thought. As you go about your day, take a moment to consider, what are some of the hidden hierarchies at play in your life? How are you using or being used by the power of rhetoric? And what experiences, big or small, have given you a taste of that feeling of transcendence?
Keep those questions simmering. You might be surprised by the insights that emerge.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Kenneth Burke's A Rhetoric of Motives. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking out those moments of connection and understanding.